Good evening and welcome back to Hidden Fears. Tonight we're traveling to America's last frontier, Alaska, where the sun disappears for months and the wilderness stretches farther than anywhere else on Earth. These 10 true disturbing Alaskan horror stories come from those who faced the unthinkable in the frozen darkness. Hunters stalked by something that walks on two legs, researchers who witnessed what hides in the polar night, and survivors of encounters that authorities still can't explain. Each account will pull you into a world where isolation meets terror, and the cold isn't the only thing that can kill you. If you're new to Hidden Fears, subscribe now for chilling true horror stories posted regularly. Hit that notification bell, because when darkness falls in Alaska, you'll want to hear these warnings. Now let's journey into the frozen unknown, where the northern lights witness unspeakable horrors. When I was working at a diner in Anchorage in 1982, I served a man who would later become Alaska's most infamous serial killer. What I didn't know was that I was supposed to be his next victim. To this day, I cannot shake the feeling that something beyond my own instincts saved my life that winter. It was November 1982, and I had just turned 22 years old. I was working the late shift at the Nordic Lights Diner on 4th Avenue in downtown Anchorage, trying to save enough money to finally finish my degree at the University of Alaska. The diner was one of those classic American establishments with red vinyl booths, a long counter with spinning stools, and a jukebox in the corner that only played country music. We got a mix of regulars, oil workers coming off their shifts, truck drivers passing through, and locals who did not want to cook for themselves after a long day. Alaska in November is a special kind of darkness. The sun barely made an appearance, rising late and setting early, leaving us with maybe 4 or 5 hours of weak daylight. By the time my shift started at 4 p.m., it was already pitch black outside. The wind would howl down from the Chugach Mountains, bringing with it a cold that seemed to seep through the walls and settle into your bones no matter how high we cranked the heat. I had been working at the diner for about 8 months when he first came in. His name was Robert, though I would not learn his last name until much later. He was a regular customer, maybe in his early 40s, average height, with a receding hairline and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an almost bookish appearance. He was quiet, polite, always ordered the same thing, coffee black, and whatever the special was that day. He would sit in the corner booth by the window, reading the newspaper or doing what looked like paperwork. Nothing about him stood out. Nothing about him seemed dangerous. That was the thing about Robert. He looked like everyone's harmless uncle or the accountant who did your taxes. He had a slight stutter when he spoke, which somehow made him seem even more unthreatening. He would leave a decent tip, never caused any trouble, and after a few weeks, I stopped really noticing him. He was just another face in the endless parade of customers who came through those doors. It was mid-December when things started to change. Robert began showing up more frequently, sometimes 3 or 4 times a week. He started asking me questions, casual things at first. How long had I lived in Anchorage? Was I from Alaska originally? Did I like working nights? I answered politely, the way you do when you're trying to be friendly with customers without encouraging anything more. But then the questions became more specific. He asked what time my shift ended. He asked if I drove to work or if someone picked me up. He asked where I lived, though I deflected that one by saying vaguely, on the north side of town. There was something in the way he asked these questions, a particular intensity in his pale blue eyes, that made my stomach tighten. But I told myself I was being paranoid. This was Alaska. People were friendly. They made conversation. It did not mean anything. One night in early January, I was closing up the diner with my coworker Linda. It was just past midnight, and we were the last ones there. As I grabbed my coat from the back, Linda pulled me aside. Her face was serious in a way I had not seen before. "That guy who comes in here, she said quietly. The one with the glasses, who always sits in the corner. Robert. What about him? I asked, buttoning up my coat. He was asking me about you tonight. Wanted to know what kind of car you drive, what route you take home. She paused, her expression troubled. Emily, I do not like it. There was something off about the way he was asking, like he was planning something. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the Alaskan winter. What did you tell him? Nothing, Linda said firmly. I told him I did not know and that he should probably stop asking questions like that. He left right after, but Emily, be careful, okay? Maybe have someone walk you to your car for a while. I promised her I would be careful, but the truth was I could not afford to be scared. I needed this job, and I lived alone in a tiny studio apartment. There was no one to walk me to my car, no one to pick me up. I had a can of pepper spray in my purse that my mother had insisted I carry, and I made sure it was easily accessible. For the next week, Robert did not come in. I allowed myself to relax, to think that maybe Linda's warning had scared him off, that he had moved on to bothering someone else, or maybe realized how inappropriate his questions had been. But I was wrong. He came back on a Thursday night, about 2 weeks after Linda's warning. It was one of those brutally cold Alaskan nights where the temperature had dropped to 15 below zero, and the air hurt to breathe. The diner was nearly empty, just Robert, an elderly couple in one of the booths, and a trucker at the counter. Robert did not sit in his usual spot. Instead, he took a seat at the counter, right in front of where I was working. When I brought him his coffee, he smiled at me. It was not a warm smile. There was something calculated about it, something that made me want to step back. Emily, he said, and hearing my name in his mouth made my skin crawl. I was wondering if I could offer you a ride home tonight. It is awfully cold out there, and I noticed your car has been having trouble starting. I had not told him about my car troubles. I had not told anyone at the diner except Linda, which meant he had been watching me struggle with my old Honda in the parking lot, watching me as I left work, watching me far more than I had realized. No, thank you, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the fear rising in my chest. I have a ride tonight. It was a lie, but I needed him to believe someone was waiting for me, that I would not be alone. His smile faded slightly. Are you sure? I really do not mind. I live up north too. It would not be any trouble. I'm sure, I said firmly. But thank you for the offer. I walked away before he could say anything else, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stayed in the back as much as possible for the rest of his visit, sending Linda out to refill his coffee. When he finally left an hour later, I watched through the window as he got into a car, a small airplane emblem hanging from his rearview mirror, and sat there. Just sat there in the parking lot with his engine running. He was still there when my shift ended at midnight. Linda insisted on following me home that night. We walked out together, and she made a point of loudly saying goodbye and mentioning that she would see me tomorrow. Robert's car was parked 3 spaces away from mine. As I unlocked my door, I could feel his eyes on me. Linda waited until I started my car before she left, and I watched in my rearview mirror as Robert pulled out behind me. He followed me. Not closely, but deliberately. Every turn I made, he made. Every light I stopped at, he stopped at. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, my mind racing. I could not lead him to my apartment. I could not let him know where I lived. I had a friend who lived about 15 minutes away, closer to downtown. Sarah was a night owl, a photographer who often worked late in her home darkroom. Without thinking, I turned toward her neighborhood, praying she would be awake. I watched my mirrors obsessively. Robert's car was still there, maintaining the same distance. When I turned onto Sarah's street, I drove past her house once, then circled back. Robert's car slowed but did not follow me around the block. Instead, he parked at the corner, his headlights off but his engine still running. I pulled into Sarah's driveway and ran to her door, pounding on it until she answered, confused and alarmed. I spent the night at Sarah's house. She called the police, but they said there was not much they could do. He had not threatened me, had not touched me. Following someone was not illegal if he claimed he was just driving in the same direction. They took a report, got Robert's license plate number, but that was it. They suggested I vary my schedule, park in well-lit areas, consider getting a restraining order if he continued to bother me. For the next 3 weeks, I changed everything. I switched my shifts at work, started parking under the streetlight right in front of the diner, and had Linda or one of the other servers walk out with me every single night. Robert came in twice more, but when I refused to serve him and had the manager ask him to leave, he stopped coming altogether. I thought it was over. I thought I was safe. It was late February when I saw the news. A woman's body had been found in the Nick River area north of Anchorage. Then another, then another. The police arrested a man named Robert Hansen, a local baker with a wife and children, a man who seemed like a pillar of the community, a man with wire-rimmed glasses and a slight stutter. They found a map in his house, a map with little crosses marked on it, showing where he had buried his victims. 17 crosses, 17 women. They found evidence that he had been hunting women, literally hunting them. He would kidnap them, fly them out to remote areas in his small plane, release them, and then hunt them like animals. When the police interviewed women who had encountered Hansen but escaped, I was one of the people they called. They showed me photographs, and my blood ran cold. It was him, Robert from the diner. Robert Hansen, the butcher-baker. The detective told me something that still haunts me to this day. They found a notebook in Hansen's house. In it, he kept notes about potential victims, their schedules, their habits, their routines. My name was in that notebook, my work schedule, my car description, notes about where he thought I lived. The only reason I survived, the detective told me, was because I had not gotten into his car that night, because I had gone to Sarah's house instead of my own apartment, because he lost track of me before he could finalize his plan. 3 of Hansen's confirmed victims had worked as waitresses. 2 of them had been offered rides home by a friendly regular customer. Both of them had accepted. I attended Robert Hansen's trial in 1984. He was sentenced to 461 years plus life without parole. I looked at him across that courtroom, and he looked back at me. For just a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or regret that I was the one who got away. I left Alaska a year later. I could not stay in that place knowing what had almost happened to me, knowing how close I had come to becoming one of those crosses on his map. I finished my degree in Seattle, got married, had children of my own. But sometimes, on cold winter nights, when the wind howls and the darkness settles in early, I think about that moment in the diner when Robert Hansen offered me a ride home. I think about the instinct that made me say no, the fear that made me drive to Sarah's house instead of my own. I think about the women who said yes, who trusted a man who looked harmless, who seemed kind. I do not know what made me different from them. I do not know if it was luck, intuition, or something else entirely. But I know that when I see Robert Hansen's face in my nightmares, and I still do, even after all these years, I whisper a prayer for the women who were not as fortunate as I was, because in Alaska, in that long winter darkness, a monster walked among us, and he looked just like everyone else. I do not typically believe in supernatural things. I'm a man of science, trained as a meteorologist, someone who puts faith in data and observable phenomena. But what I experienced during the polar night in Barrow, Alaska, in January 2015 shattered every rational belief I had ever held. There are some things that science cannot explain, and some darkness that has nothing to do with the absence of sunlight. My name is James, and I was 28 years old when I accepted a 6-month contract position at the Barrow Arctic Research Station, now known as Utqiagvik. For those unfamiliar with Alaska's northernmost point, Barrow sits 320 miles above the Arctic Circle, making it one of the most isolated communities in the United States. But the isolation was not what made it unnerving. It was the darkness. From mid-November to mid-January, Barrow experiences what is called the polar night, a period of roughly 65 days when the sun does not rise above the horizon, not once. For more than 2 months, the town exists in a state of perpetual twilight and darkness, with only a few hours of dim twilight around noon to break up the endless black. I had read about the psychological effects of polar night, how it could cause depression, anxiety, and paranoia. What I had not read about was what lived in that darkness. I arrived in early December, just as the polar night was settling in. The research station was a collection of prefabricated buildings connected by heated tunnels, situated about 3 miles outside of Barrow proper. There were 12 of us working there that winter, scientists, technicians, and support staff. The station monitored atmospheric conditions, studied aurora activity, and collected climate data. It was supposed to be routine work. The building I worked in was the meteorology lab, a long, rectangular structure with floor-to-ceiling windows facing north toward the Arctic Ocean. During the summer months, those windows would have offered stunning views of the midnight sun. During polar night, they offered only reflections of our own faces against an impenetrable black void. I had been there for about 3 weeks when I first saw it. It was mid-January, around 2 a.m., though time loses meaning when every hour looks the same. I was alone in the lab, reviewing data from the previous day's weather balloons. The only sounds were the hum of computers and the wind battering against the building, a constant presence that never seemed to stop. I got up to refill my coffee when I saw a movement outside the window, just a flicker, like someone walking past. I stopped mid-step, my heart suddenly beating faster. We were 3 miles from town. There should not be anyone outside at 2 a.m. in negative 40-degree weather. I walked slowly to the window and pressed my face against the glass, cupping my hands to block out the interior light. At first, I saw nothing. Just darkness and the faint outline of snow drifts illuminated by the station's exterior, lights. Then I saw it again, a figure standing about 30 yards from the building, just at the edge where the light faded into darkness. It was tall, impossibly tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet. It stood completely still, facing the building, facing the window, facing me. I stepped back from the glass, my breath fogging against the cold pane. My mind raced for rational explanations. A trick of the light, a snow formation catching the wind, exhaustion playing tricks on my eyes. I looked away for just a moment, and when I looked back, the figure was gone. I did not sleep well that night. I told myself it was nothing, but I kept seeing that shape in my mind, the unnatural height of it, the way it had stood so perfectly still in weather that should have forced any living thing to seek shelter. 2 days later, it happened again. This time I was not alone. Dr. Chen, one of the atmospheric physicists, was working the night shift with me. We were both at our respective workstations when she suddenly stood up and walked to the window. "James," she said quietly, "do you see that?" I joined her at the window, and my stomach dropped. The figure was back. This time it was closer, maybe 20 yards from the building. In the glow of the exterior floodlights, I could make out more details, though they did not make sense. The figure was humanoid in shape, but wrong somehow. The proportions were off. The arms hung too long. The head was too large and seemed to tilt at an angle that should not be possible. "What is that?" Dr. Chen whispered. "I do not know," I admitted. "I saw it 2 nights ago. I thought I was seeing things." We stood there watching it for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. It did not move, did not sway in the wind, just stood there, impossibly still, as if waiting for something. "Should we report this?" Dr. Chen asked. "Report what?" I replied. "That we saw something we cannot explain standing outside in the dark. They will think we have polar night syndrome." She nodded slowly. "Maybe we do." But we both knew what we were seeing was real. The next morning, I went outside with 2 of the maintenance crew to look for footprints. The snow around the station was mostly undisturbed except for our own tracked paths and the areas cleared by the wind. Where the figure had stood, there was nothing. No footprints, no indication that anything had been there at all. "You sure you saw something?" asked Marcus, one of the maintenance guys. "The darkness messes with people's heads up here, happens every year." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe it was just my mind playing tricks. But I had not been alone. Dr. Chen had seen it too. That night, I was not scheduled to work, but I could not sleep. I lay in my small room in the dormitory building, listening to the wind and thinking about that figure. Around midnight, I heard voices in the hallway, concerned voices. I got dressed and stepped outside to find 4 other staff members gathered near the common area window. "It's back," someone said when they saw me. I walked to the window and felt my blood turn to ice. The figure was there, but now it was right outside the dormitory building, standing in the small courtyard between buildings. We were looking at it from above, from the 2nd floor, which meant we were essentially at eye level with it. And we could see its face, except it did not have a face. Where features should have been, there was only smooth darkness, like someone had wrapped a featureless black cloth around a skull. But I could feel it looking at us. All of us. Its head turned slowly, taking in each person standing at the window, and though it had no eyes, I knew with absolute certainty that it could see us. "What the hell is that?" Marcus whispered. He had been so skeptical that morning, but now his voice shook with fear. One of the researchers, a young woman named Anna, suddenly spoke up. She was Inupiat, one of the few Alaska native staff members at the station. "We need to stop looking at it," she said firmly. "We need to move away from the window right now." "Why?" someone asked. "Because that is not something we should be seeing," Anna replied. "My grandmother told me stories about things that come during the polar night, things that should not be acknowledged, things that feed on attention." "That is folklore," Dr. Chen said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Anna asked, gesturing to the window. "Then what is that? What rational explanation do you have for something that tall, that still, standing outside in negative 45-degree weather with no footprints, no breath vapor, no sign of being alive?" No one had an answer. Anna pulled the curtains closed. "Do not open these again tonight. Do not look for it. Do not talk about it. And for the love of God, do not go outside." We all agreed, though I am not sure if it was because we believed her, or because we were too terrified to do anything else. I went back to my room, but I did not sleep. I could not stop thinking about that featureless face, about the way it had turned to look at each of us. Around 3 a.m., I heard something tapping on my window, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against glass. My room was on the 2nd floor. There should not be anything capable of reaching my window. I pulled my blanket over my head like a child and tried to convince myself it was ice falling from the roof or debris blown by the wind. The tapping continued for 20 minutes before it finally stopped. In the morning, I was not the only one who looked exhausted. Anna looked like she had not slept at all. Marcus was pale and drawn. Dr. Chen had dark circles under her eyes. Over breakfast, we learned that 5 different people had heard tapping on their windows during the night. All of them were people who had been at the common room window, looking at the figure. "We are leaving," Marcus announced. "Me and Jen. We are requesting immediate transfer out of here. I do not care if they fire us. I'm not staying here." 3 others agreed. They packed their bags that day and drove into Barrow to arrange flights out. The station manager was furious, calling it mass hysteria, polar night psychosis, a failure to adapt to the extreme environment. But he had not seen what we had seen. He worked day shifts and slept soundly through the night in the main building. Those of us who remained did not talk about it. We closed the curtains in every building as soon as our shifts ended. We avoided windows during the night hours. We moved through the station like it was haunted, and perhaps it was. I saw the figure 3 more times before the sun finally returned in late January. Each time it was closer. Each time it stood a little longer, and each time I could feel it watching me, studying me, waiting for something I could not understand. When the sun finally rose above the horizon on January 23rd, I stood outside with tears streaming down my face. The light felt like a physical weight lifting from my shoulders, like waking from a nightmare that had lasted for weeks. I scanned the landscape, the snow-covered tundra stretching to the horizon, and saw nothing unusual, nothing standing, nothing watching. But I knew it was still there, waiting for the darkness to return. I finished my contract in June and left Alaska for good. I have never been back, and I never will. People ask me sometimes what it was like working above the Arctic Circle, experiencing the polar night. I tell them it was challenging, that the darkness was difficult to adjust to, that I prefer places with normal day-night cycles. I do not tell them about the figure. I do not tell them about the tapping on the windows or the featureless face pressed against the glass. I do not tell them about Anna's grandmother's warnings or the fact that she quit 2 weeks after the sun returned and moved back to her village, because some things are better left in the darkness where they belong, and some things that live in the polar night should never be spoken about in the light. But I will say this: if anyone ever offers you a job in Barrow during the winter months, during the polar night, think very carefully before you accept, because the darkness up there is not empty. Something lives in it, something tall and patient and wrong, and it is always watching. Time is a constant. It moves forward at a predictable rate, measurable and reliable. This is what we are taught, what we believe, what allows us to make sense of our existence. But in the summer of 2018, my best friend Michael vanished for 3 days in the Kenai Peninsula wilderness. And when he returned, he swore he had only been gone for 20 minutes. I was there. I watched the search unfold. I saw what it did to him, and I still have no explanation for what happened on that mountain. My name is David, and Michael and I have been friends since high school. We grew up in Soldotna, a small town on the Kenai Peninsula, and we spent our childhoods fishing the Kenai River and hiking the surrounding mountains. By 2018, we were both 31 years old, experienced outdoorsmen who knew these woods like the backs of our hands. We were not reckless tourists who wandered off marked trails. We were locals who respected the wilderness and understood its dangers. It was the first weekend of July, prime fishing season, and we had planned a 3-day camping and fishing trip to one of our favorite spots near Skilak Lake. The weather forecast was perfect. Clear skies, temperatures in the mid-60s, no rain expected. We packed our gear, loaded up Michael's truck, and headed out early Saturday morning. The trail to our camping spot was about 4 miles from the nearest parking area, winding through dense spruce and birch forest before opening up to a beautiful clearing near a small creek that fed into the lake. We had been coming to this exact spot for over a decade. We could have hiked it blindfolded. We reached our campsite around noon, set up our tent, and spent the afternoon fishing. The salmon were running, and we caught our limit within a few hours. It was one of those perfect Alaska summer days where the sun barely dipped below the horizon, where the air smelled like pine and fresh water, where everything felt right with the world. Around 6 p.m., we started preparing dinner. We had caught 3 beautiful sockeye salmon, and Michael volunteered to clean them down by the creek while I got the fire going. Our campsite was maybe 50 yards from the water, well within shouting distance. Michael grabbed his fillet knife and the fish and headed down the narrow path toward the creek. "Be back in 20 minutes, he called over his shoulder. "I will have the fire ready," I replied. I watched him disappear into the trees, his orange fishing vest visible through the brush for a few seconds before the forest swallowed him up. Then I turned my attention to building the fire. 20 minutes passed, then 30, then 45. The fire was burning well, and I had already prepped the foil packets for the potatoes and vegetables. I called out for Michael, no response. I called again, louder this time. Nothing but the sound of the creek and birds in the trees. At first, I was not worried. Maybe he had decided to do some more fishing. Maybe he had found a better spot to clean the fish. But Michael was not the type to just wander off without saying something. We always told each other our plans, always stayed in communication. It was basic wilderness safety. After an hour, I walked down to the creek. The fish were lying on a flat rock, uncleaned and untouched. Michael's fillet knife was next to them, unopened. His fishing vest was hanging on a low branch, but Michael was nowhere to be seen. "Michael!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. "This is not funny, man. Where are you?" Silence. I spent the next 2 hours searching. I walked up and down the creek in both directions. I hiked back toward the main trail, thinking maybe he had decided to go back to the truck for some reason. I searched the woods in every direction from our campsite, calling his name until my voice was hoarse. Nothing. It was like he had simply vanished into thin air. As the light began to fade around 10 p.m., I made the decision to hike back to the parking area and call for help. We had emergency satellite phones, but in my panic, I realized Michael had been carrying ours in his backpack, which was still at the campsite. My cell phone had no service this far into the wilderness. I reached the parking area just before midnight and used the emergency call box at the trailhead to contact Alaska State Troopers. Within an hour, a search and rescue coordinator arrived, and by dawn, they had assembled a team of over 30 people, including troopers, volunteer searchers, and a helicopter crew. I told them everything: where we had been camping, when I had last seen Michael, what he was wearing, the exact location where I found his vest and knife. They searched the creek thoroughly, worried he might have slipped and fallen into the water, but the creek was shallow and slow-moving. There was nowhere he could have drowned without us finding him immediately. The search expanded. Dogs were brought in to track his scent. The helicopter flew grid patterns over the surrounding forest. Divers checked the lake. Over 100 volunteers from surrounding communities showed up to help. Michael's family arrived, his mother devastated, his father grim-faced and silent. I barely slept. I kept replaying those last moments in my head, trying to figure out what I had missed. Had he said something I did not catch? Had he seemed off in some way? But there was nothing. He had been completely normal, happy even, joking about how big the salmon were. On the second day of the search, the authorities started asking me harder questions. A detective took me aside and asked about our friendship. Had we been arguing? Was there any reason Michael might want to disappear? Did he have problems at home, financial troubles, anything that might explain why he would stage a disappearance? I was furious. Michael was my best friend. We were not fighting. He was not suicidal. He had not run away. Something had happened to him, something I could not explain, and instead of finding him, they were wasting time treating me like a suspect. By the third day, the mood had shifted from rescue to recovery. The search coordinator told Michael's family that after 72 hours, the chances of finding him alive dropped significantly. They were preparing to scale back the active search and transition to periodic sweeps of the area. Michael's mother collapsed when she heard this. His father asked me, point blank, what I had done to his son. I had no answer. I had done nothing. I had simply let my best friend walk 50 yards to clean fish, and he had disappeared. It was late afternoon on the third day when they found him, or rather, when he walked out of the forest on his own. I was at the search staging area near the parking lot when the radio crackled to life. One of the teams reported seeing someone matching Michael's description walking along the main trail, coming from the direction of our campsite. Within minutes, vehicles were racing down the dirt road to intercept him. I was in one of those vehicles. When we pulled up, Michael was standing in the middle of the trail, looking confused and disoriented. He was dirty, his clothes torn in places, but he appeared physically unharmed. When he saw me, his face broke into a confused smile. "David, what is everyone doing here? Is something wrong?" I jumped out of the vehicle and grabbed him by the shoulders. "Where the hell have you been? We have been searching for you for 3 days." Michael's smile faded. 3 days? What are you talking about? I have been gone maybe 20-30 minutes tops. I was coming back to camp and saw all these people. The paramedics checked him immediately. He was dehydrated and exhausted. His feet were blistered, and he had scratches all over his arms and legs consistent with hiking through heavy brush. But he insisted he had no idea what we were talking about. According to Michael, he had walked down to the creek, set down the fish to clean them, and then heard a strange sound coming from deeper in the forest. It sounded like humming, he told the authorities later, like a low-frequency hum that I could feel in my chest. I followed it maybe 100 yards into the trees, and then, I do not know. It felt like I blinked, and suddenly it was later in the day, and I was somewhere completely different. I tried to find my way back to camp, and that is when I ran into the search teams. They took him to the hospital in Soldotna. The doctors found evidence of severe dehydration, exposure, and physical exhaustion consistent with someone who had been lost in the wilderness for days. His watch had stopped working. The battery in his phone was dead. But Michael maintained with absolute conviction that he had only been gone for a short time. The authorities found him approximately 15 miles from our original campsite, in an area that would have taken at least 6 or 7 hours to reach on foot through difficult terrain. His boots showed extreme wear. He had lost 12 pounds. His blood work showed levels of stress hormones consistent with prolonged physical exertion and fear. But Michael remembered none of it. The last clear memory he had was hearing that humming sound. Everything after that was fragmented. Brief flashes of walking, of being lost, of terrible thirst. But no continuous memory. No sense of time passing. The searchers went back to the area where they had found him and discovered something disturbing. There was evidence of someone having walked in circles for hours, maybe days. Broken branches, disturbed undergrowth, partial footprints in the soft earth. The pattern made no sense. It was like watching someone pace back and forth, covering the same ground over and over, moving gradually away from any recognizable trail or landmark. A week after Michael returned, we went back to the original location where he had disappeared, this time with a guide and a GPS tracker. We wanted to understand what had happened, to find some logical explanation. The area where Michael claimed to have heard the humming sound looked like any other part of the forest. There was nothing unusual about it, no landmarks or features that stood out. But when we stood in that spot, both of us heard it. Just for a moment, just at the edge of perception. A low, thrumming sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It made my teeth ache and my skin prickle. We looked at each other, and without saying a word, we turned and walked quickly back to the main trail. We never went back to that area again. Michael has never fully recovered from the experience. He suffers from what doctors call dissociative episodes, moments where he loses track of time, where minutes feel like hours or hours feel like minutes. He cannot wear a watch anymore because he becomes obsessed with checking it, terrified that time is slipping away from him again. His family wanted answers that no one could provide. The state troopers closed the case as a person who became disoriented in the wilderness and experienced traumatic memory loss. The official explanation was that he wandered off, got lost, experienced severe dehydration and exposure, and his brain blocked out the traumatic memories as a coping mechanism. But that explanation does not account for everything. It does not explain the humming sound. It does not explain how an experienced outdoorsman who knew those woods intimately could become so disoriented that he walked in circles for 3 days. It does not explain why his last clear memory is from 20 minutes after I saw him, when his body shows evidence of 3 days of extreme physical stress. I have done research since then, more than I probably should have. There are stories from all over Alaska about places where time does not work right, where people go missing for days and return with no memory. where the forest itself seems to swallow people up and spit them back out changed. The Alaska Triangle, they call it, a region where more people per capita vanish without explanation than anywhere else in the country. Michael and I do not hike together anymore. We still fish, but only in populated areas, never more than a few hundred yards from other people. We do not talk about what happened in the summer of 2018, but it sits between us like a ghost, a reminder that there are things in this world we cannot explain, because somewhere, in the Kenai Peninsula wilderness, there's a place where time breaks down, where the normal rules of reality do not apply. And we found it. I just hope to God no one else does. I have investigated dozens of allegedly haunted locations across North America. I have spent nights in asylums, prisons, and cemeteries. I have documented hundreds of hours of footage, analyzed countless audio recordings, and interviewed witnesses from every walk of life. In all that time, I maintained a healthy skepticism about the paranormal, always looking for the rational explanation behind the unexplained. But what my team experienced at the abandoned Kodiak copper mine in October 2019 changed everything I thought I knew about the boundary between the living and the dead. My name is Sophia, and I am a paranormal investigator. I know how that sounds. I know the stigma attached to what I do, but I approach every investigation with scientific rigor and an open but critical mind. When I received an email from a documentary filmmaker asking if my team would be interested in spending 3 nights at Kodiak Mine, I did my research first. Kodiak is located in the remote Wrangell St. Elias National Park, accessible only by a rough dirt road or small aircraft. In its heyday from 1911 to 1938, it was one of the richest copper mines in the world, producing over $200 million worth of ore. At its peak, nearly 600 people lived in the company town built into the mountainside. But when the copper ran out, the entire operation shut down almost overnight. The workers left so quickly that they abandoned personal belongings, tools, and equipment where they stood. For decades, the building sat empty and forgotten, slowly decaying in the harsh Alaskan climate. The mine has a dark history. Official records documented 14 deaths during its operation, mining accidents, falls, equipment failures, and one particularly brutal murder. But according to local historians and descendants of the workers, the real number was much higher. Deaths among the immigrant laborers, particularly the Chinese and Eastern European workers who had no families in America, were often unreported to avoid shutdowns and investigations. My team consisted of 4 people: myself, Marcus the audio specialist, Daniel the camera operator, and Olivia who handled the electromagnetic equipment. We arrived in McCarthy, the small town near the mine, on October 15th. The film crew would be joining us, but they wanted us to do the initial investigation alone, with their cameras set up remotely to capture genuine reactions. The first thing that struck me when we arrived at Kodiak was the silence. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. The main buildings, the mill, the power plant, the concentration plant, and the workers' dormitories rose from the mountainside like the ruins of some ancient civilization. Red paint peeled from wooden walls. Windows gaped like hollow eyes. Machinery rusted in place, frozen mid-operation, as if everyone had vanished in an instant. We started setting up our equipment in the late afternoon. Our base camp would be in the concentration mill, the massive 14-story building where the copper ore was processed. The documentary crew had already installed fixed cameras in key locations throughout the complex, but we brought our own equipment as well: digital recorders, EMF meters, thermal cameras, and motion sensors. As the sun set behind the mountains around 7 p.m., the temperature dropped rapidly. By the time full darkness fell, it was below freezing. We bundled up in our cold weather gear and began the investigation in the power plant, a 3-story brick building that once generated electricity for the entire operation. The first floor was mostly intact, with rusted machinery still bolted to concrete floors. Our EMF meters started registering unusual fluctuations immediately. Not constant readings that would indicate faulty wiring, but intermittent spikes that moved through the room like something walking past. "You are getting this, right?" Marcus asked Daniel, who was filming with a handheld thermal camera. "Yeah, but there is something weird," Daniel replied, studying the display. "I am getting cold spots that do not make sense. Look at this." He showed us the screen. Most of the room registered at around 35 degrees Fahrenheit, but there were 3 distinct areas, shaped roughly like human silhouettes, that showed temperatures 15 to 20 degrees colder than the surrounding air. And they were moving. We followed the cold spots through the power plant, documenting everything. They led us to the basement level, to a section that had been sealed off with newer lumber, probably by park rangers or preservationists. Through the gaps in the boards, we could see a narrow corridor extending into darkness. "We should not go down there," Olivia said quietly. She was staring at her K2 meter, which was lighting up like a Christmas tree. "Something does not want us down there." "That is exactly why we need to go down there," I replied, though I felt the same instinctive dread she was expressing. We pulled away enough boards to squeeze through and descended into the sub-basement. Our flashlights cut through darkness so thick it felt almost solid. The air smelled of rust, mold, and something else. Something organic and unpleasant that I could not identify. We found ourselves in what appeared to be sleeping quarters, far more cramped and crude than the dormitories up above. Dozens of rotting bunk beds lined the walls. Personal effects were scattered everywhere. Boots, tobacco tins, photographs too damaged by moisture to make out faces. "This was not on any of the official mine tours," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would they seal this off?" Then we heard it, a sound like children laughing, echoing from somewhere deeper in the complex. But it was not a pleasant sound. It was wrong somehow, pitched too high, lasting too long, with an edge of hysteria that made my skin crawl. "Please tell me someone else heard that," Daniel said, his thermal camera shaking slightly in his hands. We all heard it. And it was getting closer. The laughter grew louder, joined by other sounds. Footsteps running, voices speaking in languages I did not recognize, and underneath it all, a rhythmic pounding like machinery operating. Impossible because there had been no power in this building for over 80 years. Our equipment went haywire. Every EMF meter maxed out. The digital recorders captured so much simultaneous audio that the levels distorted. The temperature plummeted so fast we could see our breath crystallizing in the air. Then we saw them. At first, they were just shadows, darker than the surrounding darkness, moving along the walls and ceiling in ways that defied physics. But as our eyes adjusted, or as they became more solid, I still do not know which, we could make out shapes. Human shapes, dozens of them, dressed in work clothes from another era, their faces smudged with dirt and something darker. They were not looking at us. They moved through the room as if replaying some long-ago scene, performing tasks we could not see, operating equipment that no longer existed. But their movements were frantic, panicked, and I realized we were not watching ordinary work. We were watching people trying to escape something. "We need to leave," Olivia said, her voice tight with fear. "Right now." We turned to go, but the opening we had squeezed through was gone. The boards we had removed were back in place, nailed tight, as if they had never been disturbed. We were sealed in. Marcus ran to the boards and tried to pull them free, but they would not budge. Daniel was hyperventilating, his camera hanging forgotten at his side. Olivia had dropped to her knees, her EMF meter shrieking in her hand. The shadow figures had stopped their panicked movements. One by one, they turned to face us, and though they had no features I could clearly see, I felt their attention like a physical weight. They were seeing us now, acknowledging our presence, and that was infinitely worse than being ignored. Then one of them moved toward me. It walked with a limp, dragging one leg, and as it got closer, I could make out more details. The clothes were burned, hanging in charred strips. The skin, or what passed for skin, was blackened and cracked. This was not just a ghost. This was someone who had died horribly, and the manner of their death was still imprinted on their form. It reached out toward my face with a hand that ended in twisted, melted fingers. I tried to step back, but my legs would not move. I was frozen, unable to even scream, as that burned hand came closer and closer. I felt heat radiating from it, heard a sizzling sound like meat on a griddle, smelled burning flesh and hair. In my mind, I heard words, not in English, but somehow I understood them. Tell them what they did to us. Behind the burned figure, other apparitions crowded forward. Men with crushed skulls, their faces caved in from rockfalls. Men missing limbs, frozen in the moment of their deaths. And children. God, there were children among them. Small bodies mangled by machinery, faces pale with asphyxiation. "What did they do to you?" I heard myself asking, my voice not sounding like my own. The response came as images flooding my mind. I saw this sub-basement when it was full of living people, immigrant workers who lived and died in conditions the company never reported. I saw cave-ins deliberately covered up to avoid shutdowns. I saw workers locked in during shifts to prevent theft. I saw a fire started by faulty wiring and the horror of people trapped behind sealed doors, while the company officials above pretended not to hear the screaming. I saw company men returning after the fire, dragging bodies out in the dead of night, burying them in unmarked graves on the mountainside. I saw records destroyed, families lied to, lives erased from history to protect profit margins. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The apparitions faded. The temperature returned to normal. The boards blocking our exit fell away, clattering to the floor. We ran. There's no shame in admitting that we ran like terrified children, scrambling up the stairs and out of that power plant. We did not stop until we were back at the concentration mill, gasping for air in the cold night. When we reviewed our equipment, we found something that made my blood run cold. The digital recorders had captured voices, dozens of them, speaking in Mandarin, Russian, Italian, and other languages. We had audio specialists translate them later. They were all saying variations of the same thing. Tell them what happened. Make them remember us. Do not let them forget. The thermal cameras had recorded everything we saw and more. The fixed cameras the documentary crew had installed captured our entire ordeal, our terror, and the entities that surrounded us. But they also captured something else. In the background of several frames, barely visible, were words written on the walls in what looked like ash or soot, dates, names, and a simple phrase repeated over and over in English. "We are still here." We tried to spend the second night. We genuinely tried, but none of us could do it. The documentary crew, watching remotely from their hotel in McCarthy, saw what happened to us and did not blame us for leaving. They saw the footage. They knew what we were dealing with was beyond normal paranormal investigation. Before we left, I did something I had never done before. I stood in the center of Kodiak and made a promise to those trapped spirits. I promised I would tell their story, that I would research the true history of what happened in that mine, that I would not let them be forgotten. Over the next year, I worked with historians and researchers to uncover the truth about Kodiak. We found evidence of at least 40 unreported deaths, most of them immigrant laborers whose families were never notified. We found documentation of the fire in the sub-basement in 1927, officially reported as minor damage with no casualties, but letters from workers describing the horror of hearing people burning to death behind sealed doors. We published a report. We gave names to the forgotten dead. We made sure their stories became part of the official history of Kodiak Mine. I have not been back, and I never will. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that sound. Children laughing in that wrong, terrible way. And I still feel the heat of that burned hand inches from my face. The Kodiak mine is a National Historic Landmark now, open for tours during summer months. Visitors walk through those buildings, take photographs, and learn about the impressive engineering and the wealth generated by copper. But they do not know about the subbasement in the power plant. They do not know about the people who died there, forgotten and unmourned. They do not know that on certain nights, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the sounds of that long-ago fire and the screams of people the world was meant to forget. I know. I will always know. And now so do you. Solo hiking in Alaska is not for the faint of heart. The wilderness is unforgiving, the weather unpredictable, and help can be hours or even days away if something goes wrong. But I had been preparing for my solo trek through Denali National Park for over a year, and I considered myself experienced enough to handle it. What I was not prepared for was the fact that the most dangerous predator in those mountains walks on two legs and carries a knife. My name is Olivia, and I am 29 years old. In August 2020, I decided to take a week-long solo backpacking trip through the backcountry of Denali National Park. I'm an experienced hiker with certifications in wilderness first aid and survival skills. I had solo hiked portions of the Appalachian Trail, spent weeks alone in the Colorado Rockies, and felt completely confident in my abilities. I had all the right gear, had filed my itinerary with the park rangers, and had checked the weather forecast religiously for 2 weeks leading up to my trip. The first 3 days were absolutely perfect. I hiked through valleys carpeted with wildflowers, camped beside crystal-clear streams, and saw wildlife that took my breath away. A grizzly bear and her cubs from a safe distance, Dall sheep navigating impossible cliff faces, and a wolf that watched me from across a meadow before disappearing into the trees. I felt strong, capable, and completely at peace in the wilderness. It was on the 4th day that I first noticed him. I was hiking along a ridgeline trail that offered stunning views of the Alaska Range. The trail was remote, requiring a special backcountry permit, and I had not seen another person since I left the main park road 3 days earlier. So when I stopped to filter water from a small creek and noticed someone standing about 200 yards away, watching me through binoculars, my first reaction was actually relief. Another human being meant I was not as isolated as I thought. I waved. The figure lowered the binoculars but did not wave back. He just stood there, perfectly still, watching me. Something about that stillness felt wrong. After a moment, he turned and walked back into the trees. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was shy, or maybe he had not seen my wave. I finished filtering my water, hoisted my pack, and continued hiking. But the encounter stuck with me, nagging at the back of my mind. 2 hours later, I stopped at a scenic overlook to eat lunch. As I was sitting on a rock eating trail mix, I saw him again. The same man, same binoculars, watching me from a different vantage point, about 300 yards away. This time, I did not wave. This time, a cold knot of fear formed in my stomach. I quickly packed up my lunch, trying to look casual while my heart raced. I consulted my map and altered my route, deciding to take a less scenic but more heavily traveled trail that would bring me closer to popular camping areas. As I hiked, I kept looking over my shoulder, but I did not see him again that afternoon. That night, I camped in a designated campsite near a junction of 2 trails. There were 3 other tents already set up, a couple from Oregon, and a solo male hiker from Germany. Their presence was enormously comforting. I joined them around their campfire, and we talked about our respective adventures. I did not mention the man with the binoculars. I did not want to seem paranoid. But at 2 a.m. I woke to the sound of footsteps circling my tent. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on gravel. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, my hand reaching for the bear spray I kept beside my sleeping bag. The footsteps stopped directly outside my tent door. I could see the shadow of someone standing there, backlit by moonlight, not moving. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Then the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. In the morning, I found boot prints in the dirt around my tent. Large prints, much larger than mine, from someone who had indeed walked in a complete circle around where I slept. The German hiker saw me examining the tracks. "You have a visitor last night?" he asked with a friendly smile. "Did you hear anything?" I asked. "No, I sleep like the dead when I'm camping." "Why? Is something wrong?" I showed him the prints. His smile faded. "That is strange. These are not from a bear or anything. Someone was standing right here watching your tent." We informed the couple from Oregon, and all three of them insisted I stay close to them for the day. The German hiker, whose name was Klaus, even offered to alter his route to match mine for safety. But I was scheduled to hike into an area they were not permitted for, and I did not want to disrupt everyone's plans because I was spooked. That decision almost cost me my life. On day 5, I left the main trail system and headed into a more remote area where I had a permit to camp near Wonder Lake. The hiking was more difficult, the trail less maintained, and within 2 hours, I was completely alone again. My satellite GPS showed I was making good progress, and I expected to reach my campsite by early evening. Around 3 p.m., I stopped to rest beside a small waterfall. I was refilling my water bottles when I heard a voice behind me. "Pretty spot." I spun around. It was him, the man with the binoculars. Up close, he was maybe 40 years old, wearing hiking clothes that looked expensive but strangely clean for someone who had been in the backcountry. His pack was small, too small for multi-day hiking, and his boots were barely broken in. Everything about him was wrong. "Hi," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and friendly. "Yeah, it is beautiful out here." "You are alone," he said. It was not a question. "My hiking partner is just up ahead," I lied, gesturing vaguely up the trail. "I am meeting him at the next campsite." His smile did not reach his eyes. "No, you are not. I have been watching you. You are alone. You have been alone since you left the main campground." My blood turned to ice. I slowly stood up, putting my water bottles back in my pack, not taking my eyes off him. "I need to get going. My partner will be wondering where I am." "I do not think so," he said, taking a step closer. "I think you and I should talk for a while, get to know each other." That is when I saw the knife. It was partially concealed by his jacket, but the handle was clearly visible on his belt. Not a small folding knife that every hiker carries, but a fixed-blade hunting knife with at least a 6-inch blade. Everything I had learned in women's self-defense classes came flooding back. Do not show fear. Make yourself a difficult target. Cause a scene. But I was miles from anywhere, with no cell service and no help coming. Causing a scene would accomplish nothing except making him angry. "Look," I said, forcing myself to sound calm. "I do not want any trouble. I just want to finish my hike and go home." "We all want things," he replied, moving closer. "I want company. I want someone to talk to. I want someone who does not have a choice." He took another step forward, and I ran. I have never run so fast in my life. I left my water bottles, left my pack partially open, and sprinted up that trail like my life depended on it, because it did. Behind me, I heard him laugh, and then the sound of pursuit. The trail was steep and rocky, winding upward through dense brush. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I did not stop. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the undergrowth, sometimes close and sometimes farther away. He was not as fast as me, but he had stamina, and he knew I would have to stop eventually. I ran for what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes. Then the trail opened into a rocky area with nowhere to hide. I scrambled up a boulder field, my hands tearing on the sharp rocks, until I reached a spot where I could see the trail behind me. He was there, maybe 50 yards back, walking now instead of running. He had all the time in the world. He knew I was exhausted, knew I could not maintain that pace forever. That is when I remembered the bear spray. I pulled it from the holster on my chest strap, checked the wind direction, and waited. If he came within range, I would have one chance to stop him. He saw me crouched behind the rocks. "Come on down," he called out, his voice friendly like he was coaxing a scared animal. "Let's talk about this. I am not going to hurt you. I just want some company out here. Gets lonely in the wilderness." "Stay away from me," I shouted back. "I have bear spray and I will use it." "Bear spray, huh?" He laughed. "That is cute. You know what? I have got a better idea." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the knife. Even from 50 yards away, I could see how large it was. "You can come down voluntarily, or I can come up there and drag you down. Your choice. But either way, we are spending some time together." I had seconds to make a decision. I could stay where I was and hope he gave up, but that seemed unlikely. I could try to run again, but I was already exhausted and there was nowhere to go but up the mountain into rougher terrain. Or I could stand my ground and pray the bear spray was effective enough to stop him. He started climbing toward me, knife in hand, moving steadily up the rocks. Then I heard the most beautiful sound I have ever heard in my life. Voices. Human voices calling out on the trail below. A group of hikers was coming up the path from the opposite direction. The man with the knife heard them too. He stopped climbing, looked back toward the trail, then looked at me with an expression of pure rage. "You are lucky," he hissed. Then he scrambled down the rocks and disappeared into the forest. The hiking group that saved my life was a guided tour of 6 people, led by 2 park rangers. When I emerged from the rocks, hysterical and bleeding from my torn hands, they immediately went into emergency mode. I told them everything. The man who had been following me, the knife, the chase. The rangers got on their radios and called for backup. Within hours, Alaska state troopers and park rangers were searching the area. They found evidence of someone camping illegally in multiple locations along the trail system I had been hiking. They found a small cache of supplies hidden under a tarp, including rope, duct tape, and zip ties. They found a notebook with dates and descriptions of female hikers, including a description that matched me perfectly. But they never found him. He vanished into that vast wilderness like a ghost. 3 weeks later, they identified him from my description and the items they recovered. His name was Marcus, and he had a warrant out for his arrest in Washington state for assault and attempted kidnapping of a woman on the Pacific Crest Trail. He had been hiding in Alaska's backcountry for months, preying on solo female hikers in remote areas where he knew it would be days before anyone realized they were missing. To this day, he has never been caught. The FBI believes he is still out there, somewhere in the vast Alaskan wilderness, waiting and watching. I still hike, but never alone, and I tell every woman I meet who is planning a solo trip into remote wilderness, the bears and wolves are not what you should fear most. The most dangerous predator does not have claws or teeth. It walks upright, talks like a human being, and knows that in the wilderness no one can hear you scream. I have worked commercial fishing vessels in Alaska for 15 years. I have seen storms that made grown men pray, waves that dwarfed our boat, and wildlife that inspired both awe and terror. I have witnessed the raw power of nature in ways most people never will. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I saw surface near our boat on a calm May night in 2017. What emerged from those dark waters was something that should not exist, something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the ocean. My name is Benjamin, and I was 34 years old when it happened. I was working as a deckhand on the Aleutian Dream, a 98-foot commercial fishing vessel operating out of Kodiak Island. We specialized in king crab and halibut, working the waters around the Kodiak archipelago, some of the richest and most dangerous fishing grounds in the world. It was early May, the beginning of the halibut season. We had been at sea for 6 days, working 16-hour shifts in brutal conditions. The money was excellent, but the work would break most people. I had seen crew members quit mid-season, demanding to be taken back to port because they could not handle the physical and mental strain. On this particular night, we were anchored in a sheltered bay on the western side of Kodiak Island, giving the crew a chance to rest before another long haul. The weather had been unusually calm for 3 days, flat seas, clear skies, and temperatures in the mid-50s, which felt almost tropical compared to the usual conditions. The captain had decided to give us a break from the relentless pace, and half the crew was sleeping while 4 of us took the overnight watch. I was on deck with Marcus, our engineer, and 2 other deckhands, William and David. It was around 3 a.m., that strange hour when everything feels suspended between night and morning. The moon was nearly full, casting a silver path across the black water. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of waves against our hull and the occasional cry of a seabird. We were drinking coffee and talking about nothing important when William suddenly stood up and walked to the starboard rail. "What the hell is that?" he said, pointing out into the bay. We joined him at the rail, following his gaze. About 60 yards from our boat, something was disturbing the water. At first, I thought it might be a whale surfacing, but the movement was wrong. Whatever was down there was not rising and falling in the smooth motion of a whale. It was thrashing, creating a disturbance that spread across the calm surface in expanding circles. "Shark," David suggested, though we all knew sharks were rare in these waters. Then it surfaced. I will remember what I saw for the rest of my life. The creature that emerged from the water had a long neck, impossibly long, maybe 15 or 20 feet, that rose up from the dark sea like a periscope. At the end of that neck was a head that I can only describe as horse-like, but larger and more angular, with a skull that seemed too massive for the neck supporting it. Even in the moonlight, I could see the water streaming off its skin, which appeared dark and smooth, almost seal-like. The 4 of us stood frozen at the rail, not speaking, barely breathing. The creature's head swayed back and forth about 12 feet above the water, and though I could not see its eyes clearly at that distance, I had the unmistakable feeling that it was looking at us, studying us. "Are you seeing this?" Marcus whispered, his voice shaking. "Tell me you are all seeing this." "I am seeing it," I replied, my own voice sounding strange in my ears. "I just don't know what it is." The creature remained at the surface for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 90 seconds. Then, with barely a ripple, it sank back beneath the water. The neck descended smoothly, the head disappearing last, and within moments the bay was calm again, as if nothing had happened. We stood at the rail for several minutes after it vanished, staring at the spot where it had been. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "We need to wake the captain. We need to tell someone about this." "And say what?" William asked. "That we saw a sea monster. They will think we have been drinking." "I do not care what they think," I said, already moving toward the wheelhouse. "That was real, we all saw it, and we need to document this." Captain Richardson was not happy about being woken at 3 a.m., but when he saw how serious we were, his irritation shifted to attention. We told him what we had seen, all 4 of us confirming the same details: the long neck, the horse-like head, the massive size. The captain listened without interrupting, his weathered face unreadable. "Did anyone get a photo?" he asked when we finished. We looked at each other. In our shock, none of us had thought to pull out a phone. The whole encounter had happened so quickly, and we had been so stunned by what we were seeing that the idea of documentation had not even occurred to us. "No, sir," Marcus admitted. "We were too shocked to think of it." Captain Richardson was silent for a moment. Then he did something that surprised me. Instead of dismissing our story or suggesting we had been seeing things, he nodded slowly. "You are not the first," he said quietly. "There have been sightings in these waters for decades. The locals have stories going back generations." He told us to keep watch and call him immediately if we saw it again. Then he went back to his cabin and returned with an old Polaroid camera, the kind I had not seen in years. "Keep this on deck," he said. "If you see it again, document it." Nobody believes stories, but they might believe photographs. We kept watch for the rest of the night, the Polaroid camera sitting on the console within arm's reach. Around 4:30 a.m., just as the eastern sky was beginning to lighten, it came back. This time there were more of us on deck. The noise had woken other crew members, and 8 of us watched as the creature surfaced again, this time closer, maybe 40 yards from the boat. In the pre-dawn light, we could see more details. The skin was definitely smooth and dark, almost black, with a slight sheen to it. The neck was thicker at the base where it met the body, which we could now see breaking the surface. The body was massive, whale-sized, with what looked like humps or coils visible in the water. Marcus had the camera ready. He snapped 3 photographs in quick succession, the flash bright in the dim light. The creature's head turned toward us at the flash, and for a moment I saw its eye, large, dark, and disturbingly intelligent. Then it dove. This time we saw its dive more clearly. The neck descended rapidly, followed by the massive body that seemed to go on forever, breaking the surface in segments like a serpent. At the very end, we saw what might have been a tail or flukes, though the water was too disturbed to be certain. Then it was gone, leaving only waves that rocked our boat. The photographs developed slowly, as Polaroids do. When they were finally clear enough to see, we gathered around to look at them. The images were not perfect, taken in low light with an old camera, but they were clear enough. You could see the long neck rising from the water. You could see the distinctive shape of the head. You could see something large and dark beneath the surface. Captain Richardson took the photographs and locked them in his cabin safe. "I will make copies when we get back to port," he said. "But nobody talks about this on the radio. The last thing we need is every media outlet in Alaska descending on our fishing grounds." When we returned to Kodiak 4 days later, the captain made good on his promise. He had copies made of the Polaroids and gave one to each of the crew members who had witnessed the creature. He also reported the sighting to the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, who took our statements and filed them in whatever database they keep for such things. But he also did something else. He took me to meet an old Alutiiq man named Joseph, who lived in the native village on the south end of Kodiak. Joseph was in his 80s, a retired fisherman who had spent his entire life on these waters. When the captain showed him the photographs, Joseph's reaction was not surprise or skepticism. He simply nodded, as if confirming something he had always known. "Jigignak," he said quietly. "That is what my grandfather called them. The old ones who lived here before the Russians came knew about these creatures. They would see them sometimes in the spring and fall, when the salmon were running and the water was calm." "What are they?" I asked. Joseph shrugged. "Fish, mammals, something else. My grandfather said they were old, older than our people, older than the island itself. He said there were not many left, that they stayed in the deep water, most of the time only coming to the surface at night when they felt safe." "Has anyone ever caught one? Studied one?" the captain asked. "No," Joseph replied, "and you should not try. These creatures do no harm. They mind their business, stay in their territory. The old stories say that those who tried to hunt them met bad ends. Boats lost, men drowned, catches ruined. Better to let them be." He handed back the photographs. "You were lucky to see one. Most people who fish these waters their whole lives never do. But I'm glad you saw it. It means they are still here, still surviving in the deep places. That is good. That is how it should be." I kept my copy of the photograph for years, showing it only to people I trusted not to mock or demand proof beyond what the image provided. Marine biologists I showed it to were divided. Some suggested it was a known animal, perhaps an elephant seal photographed at an unusual angle or a basking shark in strange conditions. Others admitted they had no explanation, that the proportions and features did not match any known species. A few, very few, admitted that there were sightings like this throughout Alaska's coastal waters going back centuries. Creatures described in similar terms by indigenous peoples, Russian explorers, and modern fishermen. Long-necked, horse-headed, massive, always seen briefly, always in calm water. always retreating before they could be studied or captured. I have been back to that bay dozens of times since 2017. I have fished those waters in every season, in every kind of weather. I have never seen the creature again. But sometimes, on calm nights when the moon is full and the water is black as ink, I stand at the rail and watch the surface, hoping and dreading in equal measure that I might see that long neck rise once more from the depths. The ocean covers more than 70% of our planet, and we have explored less than 5% of it. We know more about the surface of the moon than we do about the deepest parts of our own seas. Scientists estimate that 91% of ocean species remain undiscovered and undescribed. I do not know what I saw that night in May 2017. I do not know if it was a remnant of some ancient species thought to be extinct, an undiscovered animal that science has not yet classified, or something that exists in a category we have not even imagined. But I know what I saw. 8 other men saw it too. We have the photographs, as imperfect as they are. We have our statements, all consistent, all describing the same impossible thing. Somewhere in the waters around Kodiak Island something lives. Something massive and ancient and unknown. It surfaces sometimes, in the calm hours before dawn, when only fishermen and fools are awake to see it. I have seen it. I have looked into its dark eye and felt the weight of its intelligence. And I know, with absolute certainty, that the ocean keeps secrets we are not meant to know. But they are, there, in the deep water, in the dark places where light does not reach. They are there, and they are watching us just as we are watching them. Winter isolation in Alaska is something most people cannot truly comprehend. When the temperature drops to 40 below zero and your nearest neighbor is 10 miles away through roadless wilderness, you understand what it means to be truly alone. In January 2021, I learned that being alone in the Alaskan winter is dangerous enough, but being alone with someone who means you harm is a special kind of terror that I would not wish on my worst enemy. My name is William, and I am a writer. I moved to Alaska 5 years ago specifically because I wanted isolation, quiet, and the kind of solitude that allows for deep creative work. I rented a small cabin about 30 miles outside of Fairbanks, accessible only by a rough dirt road that became nearly impassable in winter. It was perfect for my needs. 1 room with a wood stove, a sleeping loft, a small kitchen area, and enough solar panels and batteries to power my laptop and a few lights. The cabin belonged to a man named Gerald, who used it as a hunting camp in the fall but otherwise left it empty. He charged me minimal rent in exchange for maintaining the place and keeping the pipes from freezing. It was an arrangement that suited us both perfectly. I had lived in the cabin through 1 winter already and felt completely comfortable with the isolation. I had my satellite phone for emergencies, a well-stocked pantry, hundreds of books, and my writing. The nearest town was North Pole, Alaska, about an hour away by snowmobile. My nearest neighbor, an elderly couple named Frank and Margaret, lived 10 miles east, also accessible only by snowmobile in winter. January in interior Alaska is brutal. The sun barely rises above the horizon, giving you maybe 4 hours of weak daylight before darkness settles back in. Temperatures regularly drop below -40, cold enough that exposed skin freezes in minutes, cold enough that your breath crystallizes in the air and falls to the ground with a sound like tiny bells. It was January 15th when things started to go wrong. I was working on my novel, making good progress, when I heard a sound outside around 10 p.m. It was subtle at first, footsteps crunching in the snow on my front porch. I assumed it was a moose or maybe a fox investigating the cabin. Wildlife was common out here, and they often came close to human structures looking for food or warmth. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of someone trying my door handle. Not an animal pawing at the door, but a human hand deliberately turning the handle, testing to see if it was locked. I sat frozen at my desk, my laptop casting the only light in the cabin. The door was locked. I always locked it at night, but the sound of someone trying to enter my home in the middle of nowhere in negative 40-degree weather was terrifying. The handle rattled again, more forcefully this time. Then footsteps moved around the cabin, first to the window on the left side, then to the back where the small bathroom window was located. Someone was circling my cabin, looking for a way in. I grabbed my satellite phone and the rifle I kept mounted above the door. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped both. I called Frank, my nearest neighbor, praying he would answer. "William." Frank's voice was concerned. Nobody called at 10 p.m. in the winter unless it was an emergency. "What is wrong?" "Someone is outside my cabin," I whispered. "They're trying to get in." "Are you armed?" Frank asked, his voice immediately serious. "I have my rifle." "Good. Keep it ready. I'm getting on my snowmobile right now. It will take me maybe 20 minutes to get to you. Do not open that door for anyone. Do you hear me?" "No one." The call lasted only 30 seconds, but I kept the phone in my hand as I stood in the center of my cabin, rifle pointed at the door, listening to the sounds of someone moving around outside. Then the sound stopped. For several minutes, there was nothing but silence and the ticking of my wood stove. I allowed myself to hope that whoever it was had left, that they had given up and gone away. Then I heard breathing. Close. Very close. Someone was standing right outside my door, inches away, breathing heavily like they had been exerting themselves. I could hear it clearly through the thin wooden door. "I know you're in there," a man's voice said. It was rough, strained, desperate. "I saw your lights. I know you have heat. Please, I need help. My car broke down on the road. I've been walking for hours. I'm freezing." Every instinct screamed at me not to open that door. Something was wrong. The nearest road was 5 miles away, and nobody in their right mind would walk 5 miles in negative 40-degree weather. They would have frozen to death within the first mile. And if his car had truly broken down, why had not I heard it? Sound carried for miles in the winter silence. "I cannot help you," I called back. "I have called my neighbor. He will be here soon. You can wait in my shed if you are cold." The breathing stopped. Then the voice came again, but different this time. The desperation was gone, replaced by something colder, harder. "Open the door." "No," I replied, my rifle trained on the door. "Move away from my cabin." What happened next will haunt me forever. The man started laughing. Not the laugh of someone amused, but a sound of pure rage and frustration. Then he started pounding on the door, throwing his full weight against it. The door shook in its frame but held. I had reinforced it when I first moved in, specifically because I was worried about bears trying to break in when I was away. "Open this door," he screamed. "Open it, or I will burn this cabin down with you in it." I backed away from the door, keeping my rifle aimed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Outside, the pounding continued, accompanied by sounds of him trying to kick the door in. Then he moved to the window, and I heard the sound of him striking the glass with something hard. The window was small and reinforced with metal bars. Another bare precaution. But the glass shattered on the third strike. His hand reached through the broken window, groping for the latch, and I could see his face in the dim light from my cabin. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with a wild beard and eyes that looked wrong, unfocused, and desperate. "Get away from my cabin," I shouted, raising the rifle so he could see it. "I am armed and I will shoot you." He pulled his hand back, leaving blood on the broken glass. For a moment, our eyes met through the shattered window. Then he smiled, and it was the most disturbing thing I had ever seen. "You cannot stay awake forever," he said calmly. "Eventually you will have to sleep, and I will be waiting." Then he was gone, his footsteps crunching away into the darkness. But I knew he had not left. I could feel his presence out there, circling, watching, waiting. I stood in the center of my cabin, rifle in hand, for the longest 20 minutes of my life. Every sound made me jump. Every creak of the cabin settling in the cold sounded like someone trying to break in. I kept the lights off except for one small lamp, not wanting to make myself a clear target through the windows. When I finally heard the sound of Frank's snowmobile approaching, I nearly collapsed with relief. But I did not move toward the door until I heard Frank calling my name. "William, it is Frank. Open up." I unlocked the door to find Frank and Margaret both standing on my porch, Frank with a rifle of his own, Margaret with a large flashlight. They swept the area with their lights while I explained what had happened. We found boot prints in the snow circling the cabin multiple times. We found blood on the broken window where the intruder had cut his hand, and we found something that made my stomach turn. A backpack hidden in the woodpile containing rope, duct tape, zip ties, and a hunting knife with a 7-inch blade. Frank immediately called the Alaska State Troopers on his satellite phone. They arrived 3 hours later, bringing with them tracking dogs and additional officers. The boot prints led away from my cabin toward the main road, but the trail went cold after about 2 miles. The prints simply stopped, as if the person had gotten into a vehicle or been picked up. The backpack contained no identification, but the contents told a story that the troopers knew well. This was not someone whose car had broken down. This was someone who had targeted my cabin deliberately. Someone who had come prepared to abduct or harm whoever was inside. The detective who interviewed me showed me a photograph. "Have you ever seen this man?" It was him, the face I had seen through the broken window. His name was Marcus, and he was wanted in connection with a series of break-ins and assaults at remote cabins throughout interior Alaska. He had been targeting people living alone in isolated areas, places where he could operate without witnesses, where his victims had no immediate access to help. "We have been tracking him for 6 months, the detective told me. He broke into 4 other cabins this winter. 3 of them were empty, thank God. 1 was not. The occupant barely escaped with her life. They increased patrols in the area, but Marcus was never caught. He vanished into the Alaskan wilderness like a ghost, leaving behind only his backpack and the terror he had inflicted on his victims. I did not stay in that cabin much longer. I lasted 2 more weeks before I packed up my things and moved to an apartment in Fairbanks. I told myself it was because I needed faster internet for my research, because I missed being close to coffee shops and bookstores. But the truth was simpler and more shameful. I was terrified. I could not spend another night in that cabin knowing that Marcus was out there somewhere, knowing that he might come back, knowing that I had been seconds away from something horrific happening to me. The isolation I had sought for my creative work had nearly cost me my life. The beautiful solitude of the Alaskan wilderness had become a hunting ground for a predator who understood that out there, in the deep winter darkness, people were vulnerable and alone. I still write, and I still love Alaska, but I will never live alone in a remote cabin again. The price of that kind of isolation is too high, and the memory of those footsteps circling my cabin, of that voice telling me he would wait until I slept, of those eyes looking at me through the broken window, those memories will never leave me. Sometimes I wonder if Marcus is still out there, still targeting remote cabins, still hunting people who make the same mistake I made in thinking they were alone and safe. The Alaska State Troopers told me they believe he is, that he moves through the wilderness like a ghost, staying 1 step ahead of law enforcement. If you ever decide to spend a winter alone in the Alaskan wilderness, please learn from my mistake. Have neighbors nearby. Have communication equipment that works. Have a plan for emergencies. And most importantly, remember that the greatest danger in Alaska is not the cold or the wildlife or the isolation. It is the fact that in all that emptiness, all that darkness, all that distance from help, you are not always as alone as you think you are. I grew up hearing stories about the Kushtaka. My grandmother, who was Tlingit, told me about them when I was young. Shapeshifters that could take the form of otters or humans, creatures that lived in the water and lured people to their deaths by imitating the voices of loved ones. I always thought they were just stories, warnings to keep children from wandering too close to the water's edge. Then, I went kayaking in Thomas Bay in July 2019, and I learned that some legends exist because they are based on terrible truths. My name is Ava, and I was 26 years old when this happened. I had moved to Juneau from Seattle the year before, drawn by Alaska's wild beauty and the opportunity to work for a wilderness tour company. Part of my job involved scouting new kayaking routes and testing them for safety and scenic value. I was an experienced kayaker, comfortable on the water, and excited about exploring the remote inlets and bays along southeast Alaska's coastline. Thomas Bay is about 60 miles south of Juneau, accessible only by boat or floatplane. It is a stunning location, steep mountains rising directly from the water, thick rainforest covering every surface, waterfalls cascading down cliff faces, and glaciers visible in the distance. But Thomas Bay also has a dark reputation. The Tlingit people call it Bay of Death, and there are stories going back centuries about people disappearing there, about strange sounds echoing from the forests, about things that should not exist. Our guide, a man named Robert, who was half Tlingit and had been leading tours for 20 years, warned us about the bay before we left Juneau. There were 8 of us on the trip, 6 clients and 2 guides. Robert told us the stories matter-of-factly, the way you might warn someone about bears or tide patterns. If you hear someone calling your name, he said, do not follow it. If you hear someone screaming for help, do not go into the forest alone. Thomas Bay has a reputation for a reason, and even if you do not believe in the old stories, it is better to be cautious. The clients laughed nervously, thinking he was just adding some local color to the tour. But I watched his face and saw that he was completely serious. After the briefing, I approached him privately. Do you actually believe those stories? I asked. Robert looked at me for a long moment before answering. I have been guiding in these waters for 20 years, he said quietly. I have seen things I cannot explain, heard things that still keep me awake at night. So yes, I believe them. And if you're smart, you will take the warnings seriously. We launched our kayaks from a small cove on the northeastern side of Thomas Bay around 10 a.m. The weather was perfect for paddling, calm water, partly cloudy skies, and temperatures in the mid-60s. We spent the morning exploring the coastline, watching sea otters, observing seals, and marveling at the sheer cliffs that dropped straight into the dark water. Around 2 p.m., we stopped for lunch on a rocky beach. The forest came right down to the water's edge, thick with Sitka spruce and western hemlock, draped with moss that hung like curtains from every branch. It was beautiful, but also oppressive, the trees so dense that you could not see more than 20 feet into the woods. We had just finished eating when we heard it. A woman's voice screaming for help, coming from somewhere in the forest behind us. Help me, please, someone help me. The voice was desperate, terrified, and unmistakably female. Everyone froze, looking at each other in shock. One of the clients, a man named David, immediately stood up. Someone is in trouble, he said, starting toward the tree line. We need to help her. Robert grabbed his arm. No, he said firmly, nobody goes in there. What are you talking about? David demanded. Someone is hurt, listen to her. The screaming continued, the voice moving through the forest, sometimes closer and sometimes farther away. Help me. Please. I'm hurt. Please help me. That is not a person, Robert said, his voice tight with tension. That is exactly what I warned you about. That is the Kushtaka. That is ridiculous, David said, pulling away from Robert. I am not going to stand here while someone dies in the woods. I will go, I heard myself say. I do not know why I volunteered. Maybe it was because I was younger and faster than most of the group. Maybe it was because some part of me did not believe Robert's warnings, despite his obvious sincerity. Or maybe it was because the voice sounded so genuinely terrified that I could not ignore it. Robert looked at me, his expression grim. "If you go in there, stay on a straight path. Mark your trail so you can find your way back. And if anything feels wrong, anything at all, you run back here as fast as you can. Do you understand?" I nodded and grabbed my day pack, which contained a first aid kit, water, and emergency supplies. David wanted to come with me, but Robert physically held him back. "One person is more than enough," Robert said, "and Ava knows these woods better than you do." I entered the forest, using my knife to mark trees as I went, creating a clear trail back to the beach. The vegetation was incredibly dense, forcing me to push through branches and step over massive fallen logs covered in moss. The screaming continued ahead of me, always seeming to be just out of sight. "I'm coming," I called out. "Keep calling so I can find you." "Help me. Over here. Please hurry." The voice responded, but something about it bothered me. It sounded wrong somehow, like a recording played at slightly the wrong speed. I pushed deeper into the forest, marking trees as I went. The screaming led me uphill, away from the beach, into terrain that became increasingly difficult to navigate. I was out of breath and scratched by branches when I realized something that made my blood run cold. The voice had not changed at all. It was saying the exact same phrases in the exact same tone and cadence over and over. "Help me, please. I am hurt. Please help me." Like a loop, like something mimicking human speech without understanding context or variation. I stopped walking. The voice continued ahead of me, still calling for help, but now I could hear how unnatural it was. The pauses were identical every time. The inflection never changed. It was not a person. It was something imitating a person. I turned to head back and realized with mounting horror that I could not see my trail marks. The forest looked the same in every direction, dense, green, dripping with moisture. I spun around, trying to orient myself, trying to remember which way I had come. That is when I saw it. Through the trees, maybe 40 yards away, was a figure. At first, I thought it was another hiker, someone else who had heard the screaming. But as my eyes adjusted to the shadows, I realized the figure was not quite right. It was tall, too tall, and its proportions were wrong. The arms were too long, hanging nearly to its knees, and it was standing completely still, just watching me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The figure tilted its head at an unnatural angle. Then it smiled, and I saw that its mouth was too wide, stretching across its face in a way that human mouths do not move. The screaming started again, but this time it was coming from the figure. The same voice, the same phrases coming from that impossible mouth. "Help me, please. I am hurt. Please help me." I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, not caring about direction, just needing to get away from that thing. Branches tore at my clothes and face. I tripped over roots and fallen logs, scrambling back to my feet and continuing to run. Behind me, I could hear it following. Not running, just walking steadily, never speeding up, never slowing down, maintaining the same distance, and still screaming in that terrible mimicry of a woman's voice. I do not know how long I ran. It felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. My lungs burned. My legs felt like they would give out at any moment, but pure terror kept me moving. Then I broke through the tree line, onto the beach. Not the same beach where we had stopped for lunch, but a different one about half a mile south. I could see our kayaks in the distance and hear Robert shouting my name. I turned to look back at the forest. The figure was standing just inside the tree line, barely visible in the shadows. It raised one of those two long arms and waved at me. Then it stepped back into the darkness and vanished. I collapsed on the beach, gasping for air, and that is where Robert found me. He helped me back to the group, and I told them what I had seen. David, who had wanted so badly to investigate the screaming, went pale as I described the figure in the forest. "You are lucky," Robert said quietly. "You are very, very lucky. Most people who follow that voice do not come back." We left Thomas Bay immediately, paddling back toward Juneau despite having planned to camp there overnight. None of the clients complained about the change in plans. We had all heard the screaming. We had all heard it continue even after I came back to the beach, that same loop of phrases echoing through the forest for hours. When we got back to Juneau, I did research. I found dozens of accounts from Thomas Bay going back over a century. Stories of people hearing voices and disappearing. Stories of search parties finding no trace of the missing. Stories of experienced outdoorsmen becoming disoriented and lost in areas they knew well, lured deeper into the wilderness by voices that mimicked their loved ones. The Tlingit elders I spoke with were not surprised by my story. They told me I was lucky to have realized it was not human when I did. They said the Kushtaka feed on people who are lost or confused, that they take particular pleasure in tormenting those who do not believe in them. One elderly woman, a friend of my grandmother's, told me something that still gives me nightmares. The Kushtaka do not just kill people, she said. They transform them. They turn them into more Kushtaka. So when you saw that thing in the forest, you were not just seeing a monster. You were seeing what happens to people who follow the voices. You were seeing what you would have become if you had gone deeper. I quit the tour company 3 weeks later. I could not go back out on the water, knowing what was waiting in those forests. I could not lead tourists into areas where things existed that should not be real. I still live in Juneau, but I do not go into remote areas anymore. And when I am near the water, near the forests that come down to meet the sea, I sometimes hear it. That voice, screaming for help, begging someone to come into the trees. I never follow it. I never will. Because I know what is waiting there, in the shadows of Thomas Bay. I know what smiles with that too wide mouth and waves with those too long arms. The Kushtaka are real. The old stories are true. And Thomas Bay is called the Bay of Death, for reasons that have nothing to do with superstition. If you ever visit southeast Alaska, if you ever hear someone calling for help from the forest, please remember my story. Do not follow the voice. Do not go into the trees, because what is calling to you is not human, and the help it wants is not the help you think. Stay on the beach, stay in the light, and pray that whatever's out there in the darkness loses interest and moves on to easier prey, because once the Kushtaka starts calling your name, it never really stops hunting you. Not all horror stories involve ghosts or creatures from folklore. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters are human beings, and sometimes evil hides behind legitimate businesses in plain sight. In 2010, I was working as a bartender in Anchorage, and I stumbled into something that nearly cost me my life. What I discovered was a trafficking operation that had been running for years under the protection of people with money, power, and connections. This is not a story about the supernatural. This is a story about the very real darkness that exists in human society. My name is Isabella, and I was 24 years old when this happened. I'd moved to Anchorage from California the year before, drawn by stories of good money in Alaska during the oil boom years. Jobs were plentiful, wages were high, and the adventure of living in the last frontier appealed to my younger, more naive self. I got a job working at a popular bar downtown called the Northern Lights. It was a decent place, mostly catering to oil workers, fishermen, and locals. The tips were excellent, the owners seemed legitimate, and I made enough money to afford my own apartment and start saving for the future. Around March 2010, one of the regular customers, a well-dressed man named Richard, who claimed to own several businesses in Anchorage, started talking to me about a different opportunity. He said he was opening an exclusive club for high-end clientele, businessmen, politicians, wealthy tourists, and he needed experienced bartenders who could handle a more sophisticated crowd. The money is significantly better, he told me one night, sliding a business card across the bar. We are talking about 3 times what you make here, maybe more with tips. The club is very selective, very private. We only serve members and their guests. I was interested but cautious. "What is the name of the club?" I asked. "The Midnight Sun Society," he replied. "We are not advertising or open to the public. Everything is by membership only, very exclusive. But I have been watching you work, and you have exactly the kind of professionalism and discretion we need." The business card had no address, just a phone number and the name of the club. Richard told me to think about it and call if I was interested. He said they would do a background check and an interview, standard procedure for any high-end establishment. Against my better judgment, I called the number a week later. I was tired of living paycheck to paycheck, tired of dealing with drunk fishermen and oil workers who thought good tips entitled them to harassment. The promise of triple my current income was too tempting to ignore. The interview was conducted in a downtown office building, in a suite that looked completely legitimate. There were two men present, Richard and another man who introduced himself as Daniel, the club manager. They asked standard interview questions, checked my references, and offered me the job on the spot. The pay was exactly as Richard had promised, plus room and board if I wanted to live on site. "The club is about 30 miles outside of Anchorage," Daniel explained. "Remote location, very private. Some of our staff choose to live there during their work rotation, others commute. It is up to you." I chose to commute, something that probably saved my life. I started working at the Midnight Sun Society 2 weeks later. Richard picked me up from my apartment and drove me out to the location, a large building that looked like a hunting lodge nestled in the woods off the Seward Highway. The exterior was impressive. Log construction, expensive landscaping, discreet but clearly high-end. The interior was even more impressive. Everything was leather and dark wood, with a massive bar made from reclaimed timber and a selection of top-shelf liquor that probably cost more than I made in a year. There were private rooms off the main area, a kitchen that prepared gourmet meals, and upstairs quarters where some staff lived. For the first 2 weeks, everything seemed legitimate. I served drinks to wealthy men who came in expensive cars. The conversation was quiet and professional. The tips were as promised, sometimes hundreds of dollars for a single shift. I started to think I had found the perfect job, but then I started noticing things that did not add up. Young women who were not staff members, but were not treated like guests either. They were always accompanied by one of the male members, always dressed in expensive clothes that looked like costumes, and they never spoke unless spoken to. Their eyes had a vacant quality that reminded me of trauma victims. I asked one of the other bartenders, a woman named Anna, about them. She pulled me aside into the supply room and spoke quietly. "Do not ask questions about the girls," she said, her voice tense. "Do your job, take your money, and do not get involved. That is how you stay safe here." "What do you mean, stay safe?" I asked. "What is going on with those women?" Anna looked genuinely frightened. "I'm serious, Isabella. Stop asking questions. Some of the girls who worked here asked too many questions, and they do not work here anymore. Nobody knows where they went." That conversation changed everything. I started paying closer attention, and what I saw made me sick. The women were not guests or staff. They were prisoners, dressed up and paraded out for members, then taken back to locked rooms when they were not needed. I caught glimpses of bruises under makeup, heard crying from the upstairs rooms, and saw the terror in their eyes when certain members arrived. I was working there 6 weeks when I saw something I could not ignore. I had stayed late to help close up, and most of the staff had already left. I was in the back cleaning glasses when I heard shouting from upstairs. A young woman, maybe 19 or 20, was trying to run down the stairs. Daniel caught her, dragging her back by her hair, while she screamed. Our eyes met for just a second as he pulled her past the doorway where I stood frozen. In that second, I saw absolute terror and a desperate plea for help. I made my decision right there. I was going to the police. I did not care about the money, or the threats, or what might happen to me. What was happening in that building was evil, and I was not going to be complicit by staying silent. But first, I needed evidence. Over the next week, I started documenting everything I could. I took photos of the locked doors upstairs with my phone. I wrote down license plate numbers of members' cars. I memorized faces and overheard names. I found documents in Daniel's office showing payments to various officials, including 2 Anchorage police officers. That is when I realized how deep this went. The trafficking operation was not just some isolated crime. It had protection from people in positions of power. I contacted the FBI instead of the local police. I called from a payphone, using a number I found online for their Anchorage field office. I told them I had evidence of a human trafficking operation and that local law enforcement might be compromised. They took me seriously. 2 days later, an FBI agent named Sarah met me at a coffee shop in downtown Anchorage. I gave her everything I had documented: photos, names, dates, license plate numbers. She told me they had been investigating rumors about the Midnight Sun Society for months, but had no way inside. I had just given them what they needed. "You need to go back," Sarah said. "Keep working there. Keep gathering evidence. We will have agents monitoring you at all times for your safety." I was terrified, but I agreed. For 2 more weeks, I worked at that club knowing what was happening upstairs, knowing that I was being watched by both the FBI and the people running the operation. I wore a wire during shifts, recording conversations between members and staff. The hardest part was acting normal when I wanted to scream. I served drinks to men who I knew were raping trafficked women upstairs. I smiled and made small talk with Daniel, who I'd seen dragging a terrified girl back to captivity. Every night I went home and vomited from the stress and horror of what I was participating in. The raid happened on a Friday night in June. I was working my usual shift when FBI agents and Alaska State Troopers swarmed the building. They arrested 14 people that night: members, staff, and management. They rescued 8 women, including the girl I had seen on the stairs, who had been trafficked from Russia, Thailand, and Mexico with promises of legitimate jobs in America. The trial took 2 years. I testified against everyone, including the 2 police officers who had been taking bribes to ignore the operation. Richard and Daniel were sentenced to 20 and 25 years, respectively. Several members were convicted on trafficking and sexual assault charges. The 2 corrupt officers lost their badges and served time. But not everyone was caught. Some of the most powerful members, politicians, business owners, men with connections, were never charged. The prosecutors said there was insufficient evidence linking them directly to the trafficking, though everyone knew they were involved. I received death threats throughout the trial. My apartment was broken into twice. Someone slashed my tires and left a note telling me to drop the charges, or I would end up like the girls upstairs. The FBI had to relocate me twice for my safety. I have not been back to Anchorage since the trial ended in 2012. I live under a different name now, in a different state, doing a different job. The FBI told me that some of the people connected to the Midnight Sun Society are still looking for me, still angry that I destroyed their operation. But I do not regret what I did. Those 8 women are alive and free because I made the choice to speak up. Some of them have been reunited with their families. Others have started new lives in America. I still get occasional emails from the girl whose eyes I met on those stairs. She thanks me for saving her life. People ask me sometimes if I was brave for doing what I did. I do not think it was bravery. I think it was just basic human decency. The bare minimum of doing the right thing when confronted with evil. But I will say this. Human trafficking is not something that only happens in movies or in other countries. It happens in America, in every state, in cities big and small. It happens in Alaska, where the isolation and transient population make it easier for operations to stay hidden. The Midnight Sun Society was not unique. According to the FBI, there were, and probably still are, similar operations throughout Alaska, hidden behind legitimate businesses, protected by corrupt officials, preying on vulnerable women who nobody will miss. If you see something that does not seem right, women who seem afraid or controlled, businesses that operate with excessive secrecy, people who are not allowed to speak or move freely, please report it. Call the FBI, call the National Human Trafficking Hotline, call someone who can help, because somewhere out there, right now, there are women trapped in situations like the one I discovered in 2010. They are praying that someone will notice, someone will care enough to help them. I was just a bartender who noticed something wrong, but that was enough to save 8 lives and shut down an operation that had been running for over 5 years. You can make a difference too. You just have to be willing to see what others choose to ignore. This happened just last year, in March 2024, and I swear to you that every word of what I'm about to tell you is true. This is not some story I heard from a friend of a friend, not some legend passed down through generations. This happened to me and my brother, and neither of us can explain it. We found shelter in a cabin that should not exist, in a place where no cabin has ever been built. And when we tried to find it again, we discovered that, according to every map and record, we were saved by something impossible. My name is David, and my younger brother Michael is 29 while I'm 32. We grew up in Palmer, Alaska, and we have been snowmobiling the Chugach Mountains since we were teenagers. We know these mountains, know the trails, know the weather patterns. We are not amateurs who go out unprepared. We are experienced backcountry riders who take safety seriously and respect the power of the Alaskan wilderness. In March 2024, we planned a day trip into an area we had ridden dozens of times before. A network of trails on the western edge of the Chugach, about 40 miles from Anchorage. The forecast called for clear weather, temperatures in the 20s, light winds, perfect conditions for a day of riding. We left early, around 8 a.m., on our snowmobiles with full tanks of gas, emergency supplies, GPS units, and satellite phones. Everything was going perfectly for the first few hours. The snow conditions were ideal, the sun was shining, and we were having the time of our lives carving through fresh powder on familiar trails. Around 1 p.m., we stopped for lunch on a ridge that offered spectacular views of the surrounding peaks. We were sitting on our sleds, eating sandwiches, and drinking coffee from our thermoses when Michael noticed something strange about the sky to the west. "That does not look good," he said, pointing to a wall of gray clouds moving toward us with alarming speed. I checked my phone for an updated weather forecast, but we had no signal up on the ridge. The GPS showed clear skies in the area, but what we were seeing with our own eyes told a different story. Within minutes, the wall of clouds had reached us, and the temperature dropped noticeably. "We need to head back," I said, packing up our lunch. "Right now." We started back down the trail, but within 10 minutes, the storm hit with a fury that took us both by surprise. One moment we could see clearly, the next we were in a complete whiteout. Snow was falling so heavily and the wind was blowing so hard that I could barely see Michael's snowmobile even though he was only 15 feet ahead of me. "Stay close," I shouted over the wind, though I doubted he could hear me. We slowed to a crawl, following the GPS coordinates of the trail we had taken in. But the whiteout was so complete that we could not see landmarks, could not see the trail markers, could not see anything except swirling white in every direction. It was like being inside a snow globe that someone was shaking violently. Then, in a moment of miscommunication that we would both replay in our minds 1,000 times, we got separated. Michael veered slightly left around what he thought was a tree, and I went right. By the time I realized he was not behind me, I could not see him anymore. "Michael," I screamed into the whiteout. "Michael, where are you?" I could not hear his snowmobile over the roar of the wind. I pulled out my satellite phone with shaking hands, but it had no signal, something that should have been impossible with satellite technology. But in that storm, with that visibility, nothing seemed to work right. I stopped my snowmobile and tried to think rationally. Standard procedure when separated in a storm is to stay put and wait for the weather to clear, but the temperature was dropping rapidly, and I could already feel the cold seeping through my gear. I could not just sit there and freeze. I started my sled again and moved slowly in what I thought was the direction Michael had gone. I called his name over and over until my voice was hoarse. I rode for what felt like hours, my gas gauge dropping steadily, my body getting colder by the minute. That is when I saw the light. Just a faint glow through the whiteout, but it was definitely there. I rode toward it, hoping desperately that it was Michael with a flare or flashlight. As I got closer, the light became brighter, and I realized it was coming from a window. A cabin. There was a cabin out here, right where I needed it. I abandoned my snowmobile and stumbled through the snow to the door. It was unlocked. I pushed it open and nearly collapsed with relief at the warmth that greeted me. The cabin was small but well maintained. There was a wood stove in the corner, with a fire already burning, casting warm light throughout the single room. A simple cot with blankets sat against one wall. A small table held supplies, matches, a kerosene lamp, canned food, and bottled water. Everything you would need to survive. But the strangest thing was that it looked recently occupied. The fire in the stove was burning strong, as if someone had just added wood to it. The cot had been made with military precision. There was a fresh pot of coffee staying warm on the stove. "Hello?" I called out. "Is anyone here?" No response. I checked the small bathroom. Empty. There was nowhere else someone could be hiding. I was alone in this cabin, but someone had definitely been here very recently. The fire alone proved that. I went back outside and tried my satellite phone again, still no signal. I shouted for Michael until my throat hurt, but the wind swallowed my voice. I could not see more than 5 feet in any direction. I went back inside and made a decision. I would wait out the storm here, keep the fire going, and hope that Michael had found similar shelter. As soon as the whiteout cleared, I would go looking for him. I sat by the stove, drinking the mysteriously fresh coffee and trying to understand where this cabin had come from. I had ridden this area dozens of times and had never seen any structures. There were no cabins marked on any of the maps I had studied over the years. Yet, here it was, perfectly stocked, perfectly warm, appearing exactly when I needed it most. The storm raged for hours. I added wood to the fire from a well-stocked pile beside the stove. I ate some of the canned food, drank the coffee, and wrapped myself in the blankets. Despite my fear for Michael, despite the impossibility of the situation, I eventually fell asleep from exhaustion. I woke to silence. The wind had stopped. I checked my watch. It was 6 a.m. I'd been in the cabin for over 12 hours. I jumped up and ran outside. The storm had passed completely. The sky was clear, the sun was rising, and I could see for miles, and what I saw made my heart sink. My snowmobile was buried in snow about 30 yards from the cabin door. But the cabin itself, I turned around to look at it, was old and weathered in the morning light, as if it had been here for decades. I tried my satellite phone. It worked immediately. I called search and rescue, reported my location using my GPS coordinates, and asked about Michael. They told me he had called them hours earlier, that he was safe and waiting for me in Girdwood. When the rescue helicopter arrived 2 hours later, the first thing the pilot said confused me. "How did you know about this cabin?" he asked. "It is not on any of our maps." "I just found it," I said. "It saved my life." They airlifted me back to Girdwood where Michael was waiting. When we hugged, we both started crying. He told me his story. He'd gotten turned around in the whiteout, ridden for hours, and then saw a light. He found the exact same cabin I had, the same fire, the same fresh coffee, the same impossible shelter appearing exactly when he needed it. "But that does not make sense," I said. "We were miles apart." I rode for at least an hour before I found the cabin. "So did I," Michael said, "in the opposite direction. We both had GPS coordinates from where we had spent the night. We pulled them up on our phones and stared at the map. According to our coordinates, Michael and I had been 17 miles apart. We had found the same cabin in 2 completely different locations. 3 days later, we went back with a guide and a full search team. We had the exact GPS coordinates of where I had found the cabin. We rode straight there, following the coordinates precisely. There was nothing. No cabin, no clearing, no sign that any structure had ever been there. My snowmobile was there, right where I had left it, still buried in snow, but the cabin was gone. We went to Michael's coordinates next. Same result. Nothing but wilderness. No sign of any structure, no indication that a cabin had ever existed in that location. We contacted the Alaska Department of Natural Resources, the Forest Service, and local historians. We asked about cabins in the Chugach Mountains in that area. They checked every database, every historical record, every map going back 100 years. There has never been a cabin in either of the locations where Michael and I spent the night. No structure has ever been built. No permits have ever been issued. No historical records exist. According to every official source, the cabin we sheltered in does not exist and never has. But we both spent the night there. We both drank the coffee and sat by the fire. We both survived a deadly storm because that cabin appeared exactly when we needed it. The rescue pilot had a theory. He was an older guy, had been flying in Alaska for 30 years. When we told him the full story, he nodded slowly. "You are not the first," he said. "Every few years, someone reports finding a cabin that should not be there, that saves their life, and then vanishes. Always during whiteouts, always when someone is about to die from exposure. The old-timers call it the ghost cabin. They say it appears to save people who are meant to survive, who have more to do in this life." "That is impossible," I said. "So is finding the same cabin in two places 17 miles apart," he replied. "But you did it. So maybe impossible is not the right word. Maybe the mountains have their own way of taking care of people." Michael and I still snowmobile together, but we are more cautious now. We never ride when storms are forecasted. We always tell someone exactly where we are going, and we carry even more emergency equipment than before. But sometimes, when we are up in the Chugach Mountains on a clear day, we look at the wilderness around us and wonder, is that cabin still out there somewhere, waiting for the next person who needs it? Does it appear and disappear according to some pattern we cannot understand? I do not know what saved us that night in March 2024. I do not know if it was coincidence, if it was something supernatural, or if it was some phenomenon that science simply has not explained yet. All I know is that Michael and I should have died in that whiteout. We were separated, lost, freezing, and running out of options. And then we found a cabin that does not exist in two places at once, 17 miles apart. We found shelter that saved our lives and then vanished without a trace. The mountains of Alaska hold many secrets. This is just one of them, and I am grateful every single day that whatever force governs those mountains decided we deserved to survive. Because we did survive. Against all odds, against all logic, we made it home. And somewhere in the Chugach Mountains, in a location that shifts and changes, there is a cabin with a warm fire and fresh coffee, waiting for the next person who needs a miracle. I have seen it. I have been saved by it, and I will never stop believing in it, no matter what the maps and records say. Some things are real even when they are impossible. The ghost cabin is one of them.